Welcome to the deep dive. Whether you're, prepping for a meeting, cashing up on education trends, or just a really curious learner, our mission today is to unpack a incredibly fascinating model for K-12 mental health support.
Yeah, it's a really unique approach we're looking at today.
Exactly. So imagine it is like 8 o'clock on a Sunday night. You're a teacher in Georgia. You are sitting at your kitchen table. You've got this towering stack of papers to grade. You're fielding angry emails from parents, and you just have this rising physical dread about Monday morning.
Oh, that Sunday night dread. A
Yeah.
very specific, heavy feeling.
Right. And today's sources, which are a stack of informational and promotional texts about a comprehensive teletherapy initiative called MentalSpace School, they actually argue that this dread isn't just, an unavoidable byproduct of teaching.
Right, they frame it as a systemic failure.
Exactly. And our mission today is to look at how this program in Georgia is trying to fix that failure. Because we usually treat schools like these academic factories, right? Inputs go in, educated students come out. But based on this text, they function more like emotional emergency room.
That is a great way to put it, an emotional emergency room.
Yeah, but here's my question for you, because you've looked at the material. Why is the source explicitly targeting the teachers first rather than just jumping straight to the students?
Well, to understand this model, we really have to examine the specific emotional labor placed on educators first. I mean, that framing changes how you evaluate the whole system.
Right.
If the school is an emergency room, the immediate question becomes, well, who's running the triage? And MentalSpace School's starting point is intensely focused on the psychological toll carried by the adults in the building.
Which feels so counterintuitive for a K-12 mental health program, to spend so much of the foundational material talking about adults.
It does seem backwards at first glance, yeah.
But my read is that they view the educator as the actual bottleneck for student wellness. Like, if the teacher is drowning, no student intervention is going to be effective. Is that how you're reading the strategy here?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the core of their entire model. The text lays this foundation that the emotional well-being of the teacher is literally the bedrock of the classroom environment. They argue that the adults are absorbing this massive psychological load. And, if you ignore that foundation, any support structure you build for the kids is just going to collapse under its own weight.
Yeah, the texts explicitly call out this invisible backpack that teachers are carrying around, which is such a striking image.
It really is.
It's this emotional labor that absolutely does not show up on any lesson plan. And the clinical terminology they use in the source is heavy. They're not just saying teachers are tired. They specifically mention secondary trauma and compassion fatigue.
Right, and we should probably pull those apart because those terms describe very different mechanisms of burnout.
Let's do it. What's the difference?
So, compassion fatigue is a state of profound physical and mental exhaustion. It comes from just a constant depletion of empathy. Teachers spend all day acting as the emotional regulators for, 30 different children.
Just giving out energy constantly.
Exactly. But secondary trauma, that's a completely different neurological mechanism. The text really highlights the burden of watching kids struggle with things that no child should ever have to face.
Because it's not just teaching algebra anymore. It's realizing the kids struggling with algebra in the second row is also dealing with severe food insecurity.
Or a highly volatile home life.
Right, or a systemic community issue that the teacher has absolutely zero power to fix.
Yeah, and taking that further, secondary trauma happens when you are indirectly but constantly exposed to someone else's trauma. Teachers hear the stories. They see the behavioral signs. And neurologically, when you're an empathetic person exposed to that level of distress, your brain processes a fraction of that trauma as if it were happening to you.
Wait, really? It actually rewires you?
It does. Over time, that chronic exposure fundamentally rewires your nervous system. Your own fight-or-flight response gets hijacked.
That is terrifying.
Now add that biological toll to the multifaceted pressure cooker they describe in the text. Constant shifting demands from administration, intense scrutiny from parents, and, a relentless news cycle.
Yeah, a news cycle that frequently paints schools as these massive political battlegrounds. Instead of just being an educator, you become the emotional grounding wire for 30 different electrical storms a day.
That's exactly what it is.
And the text makes this really pointed effort to counteract the traditional mentality that teachers just need to, grit their teeth and bear it. It says, and I'm quoting here, you don't have to be in crisis to deserve support. You don't have to hit a wall. You don't have to justify why you're reaching out.
Which is a huge messaging shift.
It is, and it sounds incredibly supportive in a brochure, right? But practically, and this is where I want to push back a little, doesn't the system implicitly force them to justify their exhaustion anyway? Are we just slapping a teletherapy band-aid on a deeply broken system?
I mean, that is the most common and honestly valid critique of modern workplace wellness initiatives, right? They often put the burden of fixing systemic stress back on the individual who's already stressed.
Exactly. Here's an app. Good luck with your impossible job.
Right. But if we look closely at the specific logistics of MentalSpace School in the source material, it actually represents a structural shift. It's not just a Band-Aid.
Okay, how so? Because a broken system is still broken.
Think about the mechanics of traditional therapy. A teacher works from, say, 7:30 in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon, and often much later with grading.
Oh, yeah, always later.
Well, traditional clinical therapy hours are 9 to 5. In the old model, the system demanded that a teacher take time off to get help.
Which means writing a comprehensive substitute teacher plan that takes like 2 hours of additional work just to miss 1 hour of class.
Exactly. The friction is so high that they simply don't go. But the text points out that MentalSpace School structurally bypasses this by offering evening and weekend sessions that fit an educator's actual life.
Ah, I see. And it also emphasizes providing therapists who uniquely understand the pressures of being in the classroom, which I think is huge.
It's a game changer.
Yeah, because you don't want to spend the first half of your session just explaining what an IEP is, an individualized education program, or, why a sudden shift in standardized testing is completely ruining your month.
Right, you want to talk to someone who already speaks the language of the school system. By integrating confidential, same-day teletherapy that works around their schedule with specialized providers, they shift mental health care from a reactive emergency to a proactive baseline.
You don't have to wait until you literally can't get out of bed.
Exactly. They're actively trying to prevent that Sunday night dread from metastasizing into secondary trauma in the first place.
So if treating the teacher prevents the classroom environment from collapsing, then treating the student is what actually rebuilds it, right?
That's the other half of the ecosystem, yes.
Which brings us to the kids. If the adults are absorbing this much secondary trauma just managing the room, what exactly are the students experiencing, and how does this program measure its impact on them?
The student ecosystem is where we really see the high-stakes reality of K-12 mental health play out. The source outlines a highly comprehensive suite of services. We're not just looking at occasional guidance counseling here.
No, it's way more intense than that.
MentalSpace School provides dedicated therapist teams for each specific school, staff wellness integration, and crucially, family counseling.
And the text mentions some incredibly heavy lifting on the student side. We're talking active crisis intervention alongside suicide and violence prevention.
It's intense.
Yeah, this goes so far beyond test anxiety. This is literal life or death for some of these kids in Georgia.
It is entirely life or death.
Yeah.
And the statistical outcomes they cite in the promotional material are just staggering when you place them in the context of modern K-12 education.
Let's hear the numbers.
They highlight an 89% improved attendance rate, a 92% reduction in anxiety, and an 85% family satisfaction rate.
Okay, I want to zero in on that 89% attendance statistic for a second, because I think it's incredibly revealing about how schools traditionally operate. It's like finally realizing that the check engine light on your dashboard is just an indicator, right? It's not the actual problem.
That's a perfect analogy.
In a school setting, absenteeism is the check engine light, but the transmission problem is the underlying anxiety.
Exactly.
Schools historically treat the absence by sending out a truancy officer or issuing detentions or threatening the parents with fines. But the real mechanical failure is the untreated anxiety.
Chronic absenteeism is arguably the most frustrating metric for administrators today, mostly because those traditional punitive measures backfire entirely.
How so?
Well, if a student is terrified of the social dynamics in the hallway, or they're overwhelmed by an undiagnosed learning disability, or dealing with active trauma at home, punishing them for not showing up only amplifies the exact anxiety that caused them to avoid the building in the first place.
Right, you're just making the school a more hostile environment for them.
Precisely.
In the old model, the mental health intervention was often just like hanging a poster in the cafeteria with the generic 1-800 hotline number. How does the text's emphasis on having a dedicated team per school mechanically change that dynamic compared to just handing out a hotline number?
It introduces the concept of continuity of care into an environment that usually completely lacks it.
Yeah.
A generic hotline provides a momentary safety net for a crisis,
Mm.
which is vital. But the person on the other end of the phone has no idea what the student's daily ecosystem looks like. A dedicated therapist team assigned specifically to one school learns the unique culture of that building.
They know the actual hallways the kid is walking down.
Exactly. They understand the specific demographic and socioeconomic challenges of that exact community. And because the program structurally includes family counseling, they aren't just treating a child in a 45-minute vacuum and then sending them right back into a chaotic living situation.
They're treating the entire environment surrounding the student.
When you lay those three outcome statistics next to each other, the causality is very clear. By directly treating the underlying anxiety, which is that 92% reduction, and actively involving the family, driving the 85% family satisfaction, the natural byproduct is that the student finally feels secure enough to walk through the front doors.
You fix the transmission, the check engine light turns off, and boom, you achieve an 89% improvement in attendance.
It all connects.
But, continuity of care is a beautiful concept, but it requires frictionless access to actually work. Brilliant outcomes and dedicated teams mean absolutely nothing if the families and the schools can't afford to use them.
Or if the bureaucracy is just too dense to navigate.
Exactly. And this brings us to the most pragmatic part of the source material. The logistics outlined in the second half look like a systematic dismantling of those exact barriers.
In any healthcare initiative, especially in public education, access is the entire game. If the logistics fail, the clinical outcomes do not matter at all.
And the text treats these logistics like pieces of a very specific puzzle. So first, they emphasize same-day teletherapy availability.
Which is huge.
It is. In the broader mental health landscape, waitlists for pediatric psychologists can easily stretch 6 to 9 months. If a kid is in crisis in October, seeing a specialist in April doesn't help them at all.
Not even a little.
So same-day availability is almost unheard of and fundamentally changes the speed of intervention. Then there is the specific mandate for licensed diverse therapists who are culturally competent.
Cultural competency is a massive, often invisible logistical barrier.
How does that play out for a student?
Well, if a student from a marginalized background finally summons the immense courage to ask for help, and they're paired with a provider who fundamentally does not understand their cultural context, their neighborhood dynamics, or their lived experience, that therapy session can actually cause more alienation.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see that.
By explicitly ensuring the provider network is diverse and culturally competent, MentalSpace School prevents that disconnect before it happens.
Then they tackle the financial puzzle, which is usually the final nail in the coffin for seeking help, right?
Yeah.
The text lists this massive roster of accepted insurance networks. Blue Cross Blue Shield, Cigna, Aetna, United Healthcare, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, and AmeriGroup.
Navigating that bureaucratic nightmare just to become an in-network provider for all those is a massive operational feat on its own.
But the single detail that changes the entire conversation is the note on Medicaid. The text explicitly says Medicaid equals $0.
That is the linchpin of the whole operation.
Why is that specific detail so critical?
Because for a low-income family already struggling with inflation and housing, a standard $20 or $40 copay per session for weekly therapy is entirely unmanageable.
They just won't go?
They simply will not go because they cannot. By eliminating the out-of-pocket surprise and ensuring that families on Medicaid pay literally $0, MentalSpace School transforms teletherapy from a boutique luxury service into a deeply accessible public health utility.
That's incredible. And there's one final layer to the logistics section that moves this from a conceptual idea to an immediate, urgent reality for administrators.
The compliance aspect.
Right. Alongside the standard compliance markers like HIPAA, which protects medical privacy, and FERPA, which protects educational records, the text explicitly offers HB 268 compliance support, and it attaches a very hard deadline, July 2026.
That deadline is everything.
The source uses this legislation almost as a ticking clock for Georgia schools. What does the inclusion of a hard legislative deadline tell us about the urgency of this program?
If you want to understand how state education actually evolves, you have to look at the legislation. Legislation is the ultimate driver of administrative behavior.
Onion laws.
Always. House Bill 268 in Georgia is an impending state mandate requiring schools to have formalized mental health safety nets and protocols in place. The inclusion of that July 2026 deadline tells us that comprehensive mental health support is no longer just a nice-to-have perk that a progressive school district might adopt.
It's becoming a legal requirement.
Exactly. It creates a powerful squeeze on the educational system from two different directions.
Squeezed from the top down by the government and from the bottom up by the community.
Precisely. From the top down, the state legislature is looking at the escalating mental health crisis and telling school districts, you have until July 2026 to figure out how to operationalize and fund support for these students.
Which puts immense immediate pressure on superintendents and principals.
Right. But from the bottom up, the families, the students, and the teachers are desperate for relief right now, today. What MentalSpace School is presenting in this promotional material is a completely turnkey solution.
They're essentially saying, we'll do the heavy lifting for you.
They're effectively telling the school districts, we will handle the complex FERPA and HIPAA data compliance. We will ensure you hit your legislative mandate before the deadline, and we will do it with an infrastructure that costs your most vulnerable Medicaid-dependent families absolutely nothing.
They're removing the friction for the patient, but they're also removing the bureaucratic friction for the school administration.
And they place the direct contact vectors right there in the text.
Right, the website, mentalspaceschool.com, and their email, mentalspaceschool@tele-therapy.com. It acts as a direct lifeline for administrators who are staring down the barrel of that 2026 compliance deadline and just, don't know how to build a mental health network from scratch.
It's a highly pragmatic approach. You can't mandate well-being, but you can systematically remove every excuse a system has for not providing it.
Wow. So let's bring it all together. Whether you are an educator listening to this on your commute, a parent navigating the school system, or simply a citizen who cares about the structural health of our communities, why does unpacking this specific model deeply matter to you?
It's about so much more than just a new app.
Exactly. The initiative outlined in these sources is about much more than the technological convenience of teletherapy. It is a blueprint for acknowledging the basic, messy humanity operating inside our educational systems.
Yeah.
It's a recognition that the people inside these buildings, both the adults at the whiteboard and the kids at the desks, are carrying invisible loads that dictate their ability to function.
And by systematically dismantling the financial hurdles, the cultural disconnects, and those logistical nightmares of traditional therapy, it ensures that tomorrow morning, both teachers and students have something, as text beautifully phrases it, quietly working in their corner.
I love that phrase, quietly working in their corner.
It really represents a profound philosophical shift in how we view education. It moves the system away from asking, what is wrong with you that you aren't performing to our metrics?
And moves it toward asking, what specific support do you need to be whole enough to learn?
Exactly.
And that leaves us with a final, lingering question for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends. If models like MentalSpace School succeed in entirely removing the friction of accessing mental health care, if they actually make therapy as routine as a $0 Medicaid claim, as immediate as same-day scheduling, and as integrated as a dedicated school team, how might the very definition of what a school is transform a generation from now?
That's the real question.
Will we eventually look back at the Sunday night dread and the era when schools were treated like high-pressure academic factories rather than holistic emotional ecosystems, not as an unavoidable reality of teaching, but as a historical artifact of a much less compassionate time? We'll leave you to think about that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.